Hi everyone, I'm Nitya Vasudevan and I teach as part of the English faculty group here at the School of Arts and Sciences, Azim Premji University, Bangalore.
Hi everyone, I am Muhammed Afzal. I teach in the English program at Azim Premji University. I teach courses in literary and cultural studies.
It's a great pleasure to have with us Professor Tejaswini Niranjana here today to discuss the diverse strands of work and research she's been engaged with over the past 40 years. At the university, there are many of us who've been taught and guided by her. There are many of us who've read her academic writing and scholarship as part of our courses. And there are many more of us who have read her recent translations of Jayant Kaikini's short stories. Professor Niranjana is currently Director, Center for Asian Studies at GITAM University, Bangalore. Over the span of her rich career, she has co-founded and founded several institutional spaces for cultural studies and inter-Asian research in the Indian context. And she's also authored a wide range of books and essays dealing with questions of translation, music, culture, migration, cinema, and so on, right? And language. Her work and writing have been a crucial part of the formation and shaping of cultural studies as a field of inquiry in the Indian context. And she's also stressed on the need to move beyond just a comparison of India and the West to bringing inter-Asian questions into this context, right? In terms of her important work, she is the author of Citing Translation, History, Post-Structuralism and the Colonial Context, Mobilizing India, Women, Music and Migration between India and Trinidad, and Musicophilia in Mumbai, Performing Subjects and the Metropolitan Unconscious. These last two projects on music have also involved collaborative filmmaking with filmmaker Surabhi Sharma and have resulted in two ethnographic documentaries, Jahaji Music and Returning to the First Beat. Combining her love of music and her work in the field of inter-Asia research, she is also the curator of the Saath Saath Project, a musical collaboration between Indian and Chinese performers. Given her long-ranging investment in the question of language, and this is something we'll come to later in the discussion, the other hat she wears is that of a translator. She has been translating since the young age of 16, and she's produced translations between Kannada and English, and also Polish and English, right? Polish and Kannada, sorry. Her recent translations of short fiction have won her state, national, and international awards. And her translations from a very young age range from rendering Shakespeare's Julius Caesar in Kannada, translating M.K. Indira's important 1976 novel Faniyamma into English, and her more recent award-winning work, No Presents Please, Mumbai Stories, and Mithu Number 2 and Other Mumbai Stories by author Jayant Kaikini. Right? We are extremely happy to have you here with us today, and we look forward to the conversation.
So we will begin by talking about cultural studies and its institutionalization in the Indian context, and later we will come to the question of it in the Asian context also. So in your essay, The Desire for Cultural Studies, you talk about how cultural studies is a new name for a longer tradition of cultural criticism, which was in various domains like social movements and things like that. So you are someone who moved away from English studies to set up the first cultural studies institution in India, CSCS, in 1998. So how do you look at this prehistory of cultural studies and the later institutionalization of it?
That's going to require a very, very long answer. But I do want to point out, just to get us started, that cultural studies is not really a term that we ever used. Those of us who founded the CSCS, it's not a Center for Cultural Studies. And I think the fact that we did not name it or hesitated to name it as cultural studies speaks to the prehistory of what has today come to be known as cultural studies in India. Why do I say that? I think that when in the late 80s, some of us who are beginning our careers in academia and people outside academia, people in the visual arts, people primarily, and people who were otherwise involved in a number of intellectual and political movements, when we, were having these occasional conversations about what is the problem with post-independence scholarship and what are the kinds of focus that it has, especially, and I suppose one should say in a place like APU, the strong focus on development, the strong focus on economics, both as a subject domain and a paradigm, led to, in many ways, the marginalization of certain other aspects of our social and cultural life that we felt we needed to understand and grasp fully uh, before we could even get into the question of development, if you like. So I think that those of us who maybe came from literature or humanities backgrounds may have been better positioned to understand this, but we were joined also by people from the more hardcore social sciences, people with a training in economics as well. And what we tried to draw attention to was the way the social science and humanities paradigms work together to foreground certain kinds of questions and make certain other kinds of questions invisible. For example, the what we began to increasingly call the culture question. And to redress this, we said, let's try and work together in a more institutional way. It's very foolish of us to think like that, but I think we managed to pull it off at that moment in our history of globalization in India in the late 90s. We said that we would focus in a research institution kind of setting on that which is always left behind by the other disciplines, and we named that as culture. The fact that in England and in other places, England in particular, with the genealogy of, say, Raymond Williams or Stuart Hall, there was some domain of inquiry called cultural studies, was not something that impacted us hugely. We didn't really think about it much. It's only when we began to discuss the question of culture that we started reading these people sometimes again and said, no, that's not exactly what we're doing. They have issues of high and low culture, of popular culture, of working class culture, and so on. And that is not where we are asking the question from, because for us, we need to factor in colonial society in particular and why culture becomes the ground of contestation. And what's called cultural studies in the West doesn't have to account for that at all, right? So, in this meandering way, one comes to this idea that if you're trying to institutionalize cultural studies in India, you have to keep in mind the disciplinary context, the historical context in particular. And this already marks us off as different from what goes by the name of cultural studies in the West.
Yeah. So you have talked about how in the Indian context and also in the Asian context, gender has been constitutive from the beginning itself of cultural studies. Unlike it being a kind of interruption in the British context, right? So, how do you look at this evolving nature of this gender culture conjuncture that you talk about in many of your writings?
I think that the point I have been trying to make all along is that one can't discuss the question of culture in India without discussing the question of gender. It's for all kinds of reasons. Maybe I'll just mention one or two of them. That if you go back to, say, the 19th century and the particular kinds of conflicts over culture that erupt in colonial society between the nationalist elites and the colonizers, if you like, that very often the solution to a particular contestation or debate or resolution to that is found in the domain of culture. Yeah, and very often this domain is tied to the question of woman, the woman question as it came to be known famously in the late 19th century. There's, of course, Partha Chatterjee's famous work. It's now really well known, but maybe just to index it briefly, the question of how nationalists resolve the women's question by giving women a re-entry, if you like, into the space of the domestic. And the re-domestication of women allowed a certain notion of Indian culture to emerge and be considered superior to what the colonized society was offering us. Yeah. So, in a sense, the idea of gender is from the very beginning, and we're talking about the beginning of the modern period, very central to thinking about culture. So I think that in my days in the feminist movement and feminist groups, we always talked about this as well. How in many ways there are different phases in which the culture and gender question come together. One, of course, would be like in social reform. I've already talked about that. When the nationalist struggle started also, there's idea that the woman should be at the forefront of the national struggle, but at the same time contained in a sense, because she could and could not do certain kinds of things. In terms of education, women needed to have sufficient education to be able to groom the citizens of the future nation, but not so much that she would decide not to get married or not to have children or leave the home or be otherwise independent in any way. So there again, I think in a different phase of the history of modern India, you have the coming together of culture and gender, and why the question of Indian culture then becomes foregrounded in and in doing so, how gender is deeply implicated in that foregrounding. I think that if you go a little further into modern history, post-independence history, there too, I think with the emergence of developmentalism and with the emergence of the need to eradicate poverty, to eradicate economic ills in the new nation, there too, there was a way by which the woman was interpellated. Of course, much later in terms of, say, microfinance, or how the ability of the woman to save and the ability of woman to, if you like, be in the forefront of alleviating the economic ills at the same time as maintaining the cultural context and the cultural traditions of what is considered to be good Indian families and so on. There again, you find that the double and triple burdens that women take on, women here standing in for gender, if you like, is already very dominant. So in many ways, the gender culture conjuncture keeps morphing. There's a substratum that remains the same across, but of course the manifestation of it keeps changing. I think we can of course come into the late 90s and globalization, the 2000s, all the many intense and vociferous debates around what is appropriate for women, which one finds even today. So this is a pretty long history of 200, 250 years of the transformations in the gender culture conjuncture. So you can see that is central to understanding the world around us, and therefore I try to keep pushing that as something crucial to the Indian context in particular, but perhaps to other Asian contexts as well.
Can I quickly ask a question added onto this? Because I recently taught problems for a contemporary theory of gender, and that was located in the late 80s, 90s period. Right? I was looking at that conjuncture and raising questions for the theorization and understanding of gender at that point, and said gender is everywhere. And even today, it is still everywhere. But would you, from that point, the historical point of that essay, that the 90s, the Mandal and liberalization, etc., all of those questions, do you see us having now a whole new set of questions emerging? Have you, do you want to reflect on whether there would be a completely different essay to write in the in today's time?
Well, I suppose with all the talk about Gen Z and even millennials who were not there at that time, there seems to be some ostensible context that is pushing us to re-articulate those questions. But I'm amazed at how relevant those are even today. Because we pointed to questions that were emerging in the public domain as really central to understanding contemporary India, post-globalization India. And that has not, that some of those processes have only intensified. If you're talking about the caste-gender conjuncture, there seemingly are some changes, but there's also some intensification of certain kinds of inequalities. So I don't know, I haven't given it some thought and I wasn't expecting this question. But I would think that while certain things have intensified, as I said, other things have sort of remained pretty stagnant. And what we pointed to in terms of a set of problematics, I think still remain to be addressed.
To come back to the question of cultural studies, so on the one hand, many of you were thinking about the culture question in the 1980s. You were dissatisfied with the way in which traditional disciplines looked at this, and also the post-colonial state looked at it. But at the same time, the frameworks of British cultural studies was not adequate in a sense because of the different kind of context. Right? So in the 2000 essay that you published in the inaugural issue of Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Journal, you talk about the need for alternative frames of reference. So how has been the encounter with the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies project? Because I remember you writing that even though they were at that point of time, much of the scholarship in the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies project was on East Asia, but even though it was from a different context, you felt that the concerns were somewhat similar. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think to be able to say why I found the concerns relevant to the way I was asking the question is because before I encountered East Asia and the kind of questions coming from there, I had already encountered another place in what one would call the global south, which is the Caribbean. And some of my early work predates my encounter with the Asian networks, if you like. And there already what the larger question was why do we need a comparative frame of reference? The broad understanding was that all work is comparative by definition. It's just that the comparative pole remains hidden because it's usually and implicitly the Western context, right? And Western used in a metaphorical sense, not a real West necessarily. In terms of the dominant frameworks, the paradigms of knowledge production, of what the kind of books that our libraries are stocked by, the complete lack of access to anything that's not produced through the machinery of the Western publishing house, etc. All of these led me to say that one needs to go actually to a place like the Caribbean to experience and encounter what what would be there that's different from what one is simply absorbing through frameworks that I later called Orientalist. But in the context where Africans have been taken as slaves to the Caribbean, it's not simply Orientalist. Although the Indians who were taken there, you can see that they were being perceived through an Orientalist lens, both by the British who employed them and by subsequent writers on Indians in the Caribbean who think of them as having perpetuating Indian traditions, even though they're so ostensibly, like obviously changing in front of your eyes. So that idea of a static civilization that is carried wherever one goes because the person carrying it is the same is something that I've challenged in my work. So the idea of the comparative frame, the idea of the fact that we need alternative frames of reference, and one way of doing that is by bringing in or articulating the pole that is and saying that this is something I will consciously choose as a context that is different from mine and hasn't simply been mediated by the Western gaze. So I had already been thinking about that, writing about it. And when I met all these friends, mostly from East Asia, some from Southeast Asia, I realized they were struggling to articulate the same question. So when I wrote this piece, they were quite happy to think that we were really, our ideas were converging. And it went on to become a central piece in that network as well, the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Network, in which one of the key figures there, Chen Guanxing, wrote a book called Asia as Method, borrowing a term from an earlier thinker. And that book was about de-imperialization, as he called it. Here too, I found resonances with the kind of work I was doing or what my colleagues were doing at CSCS. So de-imperializing, thinking of Asia as a method by which you could unpack your own context, which is what I tried to do with the Caribbean, right? I'm saying this book is ostensibly about the Caribbean, but actually it's a book about India. How do you bring the questions back to your own context is something I began to practice very actively from that time onwards.
So, a related question to this. So, when we think about the Indian context and with different kind of film cultures, literary cultures, etc., this kind of a comparative framework and also even this Asia's method, how can we use it very productively in the Indian context? For instance, to compare between situations like of different national cultures within India itself. Right?
That's very hard. I don't think you can make a mishmash of all the national cultures and then compare that to one culture that's somewhere else, right?
Okay.
I think it's not so much about the empirical content of what you're comparing, but about the way you're framing the question. I think that is more relevant. So it doesn't matter whether you're working on Malayalam cinema or Hindi or Bangla or Kannada or whatever. That's not the issue so much as what is the question you're articulating through that empirical content. And can that question find a comparative base in something else that you're looking at? So when you look at East Asian cinema, again, not to confine yourself to looking at the content of cinema only, although that's how the cinema comes to you, but to ask yourself more questions about the context in which that film has arisen and what is the context of reception, what larger issues are being sought to be resolved through cinema. I think this is the way in which you can build a comparative framework
Yeah. So here I was also thinking of the way in which there was a cross-border flow of popular culture in East Asia, and now in India we are increasingly talking about pan-Indian films or films from one language industry entering many other film industries, right? So that way, like with this popular cultures flow, does that also help us in thinking about this kind of a framework? Because I understand the problem of pitting one culture, national culture or regional culture against another one and making some kind of a mechanical comparison. But I was thinking whether this can be used in a very productive manner, this idea of Asia's method.
I think that you're very right. That I think if you start looking at the flows, you also stop looking at nation-state boundaries as determining the focus or the content of any of this. Right. In my own current work, that there won't be time to talk about, but which has to do with the Silk Road and which has to do with 2,000 years ago, I'm trying to understand the question of region in a very different way before the advent of nation states. So yes, I think flows of cultural flows of different kinds, whether it's through religion, or whether it's through trade circuits, or whether it's through different kinds of uh, artistic practices, musical practices, which today are replaced in some ways by the cinema, right? The popular flows, cinema as well as music. I think there's a lot of circulation of that. And maybe that's a way of invoking that earlier connection that we lost for some time because of the emergence of nation state boundaries.
So when it comes to the question of institutionalization of cultural studies, one anxiety has been what happens to cultural studies as an intellectual political practice when it becomes part of the academy, right? And many thinkers have talked about it. So maybe to rephrase your phrase, desire for cultural studies, is there too much desire for cultural studies, contemporary Indian? What does it mean for the project of cultural studies?
Actually, I don't see that there is so much desire for cultural studies because there are so few examples of its institutionalization. I think at the most, if you have an UGC exam called cultural studies, and you have it existing on the margins in your own department, for example, it's always English and cultural studies or literary studies and cultural studies. So, cultural studies is a hanger on in many of these. And it's only there because some faculty feel frustrated with teaching the same old text, so they want to do something different and they manage to drag in this thing. So I wrote that at a time when I felt that in many institutions, like the science institutions and the management institutions where we were working, and we're talking about 10, 15 years ago, there seemed to be a desire for cultural studies. But I don't think I would say the same thing now. Also because these questions have gotten absorbed into the mainstream and no longer need to be asked separately.
We also wanted to talk to you about your translation practice, right? And there has already been mention of translation in different ways, if not literal translation work, but translation for the purpose of theorizing, translation between social movements and academic work. So we've all it's all in feminism and cultural studies. All of this has already been signaled in some ways in the conversation, I think. So, but here I will get to the actual translation history that you have seen. So, and I just want to sort of briefly introduce the kinds of texts that you've translated for those listening, so that it's doesn't come out of the blue. So, I mean, in your early translation career, I don't know if you want to call it career, you called yourself an occasional translator, but so in the early years of translation, you have translated your own father, K.S. Niranjana's novels from Kannada to English, your mother, Anupama Niranjana's stories, right? And of course, Julius Caesar from into Kannada, right? You also, I think, early years, you translate a lot of poetry from Kannada to English. Then Fanyama
The other way around, I translated Pablo Neruda, for example.
into Kannada, which was called Marali Baruve, right? That was the collection. Then, of course, M.K. Indra's Normal Panyamma was, this is still the translation that's most often used, I think, these days, right? And then you have also worked on Polish poetry and translated it directly into Kannada. There's been no English, no, into English.
From English.
From English into Kannada. Okay. So, okay, I got that wrong, sorry. But more recently, also Vaidehi's work and Kaikini's work, the last two anthologies of short stories have been the most recent work, right? And besides this, you've also worked on Strivadi Sahitya Vimarshe, right? With Simantini Niranjana. So that has also, I think, it's not talked about as often as the fiction, but I think it's an important entry point into academic translation and what is happening in that domain. So my question first would be not to talk about the broader scene of translation, but your own practice, right? How have you seen transformations within your practice of translation in terms of it being an interpretive practice, and also how you have located your translation practice in a larger context back then, and how would you locate it now, right? Has that perspective also changed for you? Yeah.
It's very hard to answer this question because I'm very much inside it. And it's really something that someone reviewing my translations should point to. As because I haven't really said, oh, this is what has changed. One lives the change, one doesn't talk about it necessarily.
Right. Yeah.
It's even in academic writing, one doesn't do that enough. But certainly in the creative space, one doesn't often do that. But just to give you a brief comparison, if you like, in my teens when I was translating fiction primarily and poetry, it seemed to be following naturally on my creative writing practice. Because at the time I was primarily someone who wrote poetry. And it felt like, when you are lying low between poems or between books and not exactly doing any original creative writing, it became a good way of staying in touch with, the language and how to, both the languages that one was using, Kannada and English, and using that working with language, constant worrying about language to bridge the gaps between different instances of creative practice. It doesn't mean that that translation is not a creative practice. It is a hugely creative practice. But the way I approached it was, I did things that interested me. I did things that came to me. Someone asked me to do it. So it is not a consciously chosen or a very carefully curated practice.
Right.
At a very young age, you just do what comes to you. You don't worry too much about it. So I think that maybe it was a little unreflective. But at the same time, I think that engaging in that practice helped me to hone my skills at how to manipulate language in a way, whether it was English or Kannada. However, that I think my own practice as a translator led me very soon thereafter, a few years later, into a PhD project which became about translation. And there that became the book called Citing Translation. So it is about the history and politics of translation in the colonial period primarily, but the apparatus was also like a hugely technical, theoretical apparatus, drawing on continental philosophy primarily and theorists like Walter Benjamin and so on. Also drawing on my own knowledge of Kannada literature. So I think that I articulated that question perhaps for the first time of the connection between translation and colonialism, which had been maybe hinted at by earlier writers, but in this very expanded way articulated, by me. I think that having done that, I could no longer innocently translate like in the way that I used to before, because I became more conscious about the kinds of English I was translating into and what could then be the impetus between a certain word choice and certain other choice. So I think that reading Edward Said's Orientalism, for example, reading Talal Asad's work on translation, engaging in my own project and finishing that book in a few years' time, led me to approach the practice of translation, I think more self-consciously and more carefully, and maybe it didn't really affect the first draft, if you like, but the subsequent drafts and the way it finally came out was certainly informed by why I chose what I chose, and maybe an attempt to also work against the grain of the usual Orientalist mode by which especially Indian language translations came into the public domain. So I think that I encourage people to read my translations. The only other point I want to make is that what changed for me was the idea that the outwork of the translation is extremely important and as crucial as the text itself. That there was no way a translation could go innocently into the world, but it had to be seen through, refracted through the kind of conceptual and political questions that the translator was asking, and to bring to light also the actual literary context and the social context from which the original text came. I think that I've never done a translation after that time which didn't really take on board all of these. And so I pay a lot of attention to articulating this larger framework in which I place the translation.
The translation, yeah. And also so that brings me sort of to the next question, which is that with the two anthologies of the Jayant Kaikini short stories, I also, when I read them, I got the sense that you had arrived at, also in terms of choice of text, right? You were just talking about earlier, a much earlier phase in which whatever came to you or whatever you, as on a whim, wanted to translate, you went to. But now it seems to be a careful, more considered choice of the kind of text that you want to translate. And so in an afterword in one of the collections, the afterword is titled Insider Outsiderism, right? You also talk about how you are sort of magnetically drawn to Jayant Kaikini's writing because his writing doesn't come from the standpoint of any one constituency, right? That it is sort of, to put it in a certain kind of phrase, migrant stories or stories that are from people who migrate, of people who migrate, and the stories themselves are migrant in some sense, right? So, can you just talk about that a little bit, about the ways in which you have, what kind of relationship do you have then with the text, like, and what does it mean to then choose that kind of text to translate? Yeah.
That's not been the only kind of text I've chosen to
Yeah.
translate. But having worked with these texts, I felt the need to rationalize my approach,
Yeah.
and which is where this comes from. It's not that I had these thoughts first and then chose the text on the basis of the thoughts, right? In many ways, the translation work feeds into articulating this larger setting,
Right.
which you then, so you make what may have remained implicit in one's attraction for the text becomes more explicit when you try to re-articulate what a setting is. In that particular context, I think that I also share with Jayant Kaikini a very keen enjoyment of an interest in Mumbai, in Bombay city, for many, many years, because I studied there, I lived there, and so on, and as did Jayant also. And I think that what strikes us both is the fact that we are insiders to the life in Bombay. We are also outsiders because you're not fully part of it or have not remained in a place like that. So I think that's always makes for a little frisson, if you like, that you like it, but you can also not be there if you choose not to be there. But I think both of us have been fascinated by the sheer diversity of life forms that you'd find in Bombay. And the reason why it's so diverse is because ever since it emerged as a major city in the 18th century, it's been a city of migrants of all kinds. First of all, marked out by language, by cultural practices, by ethnicity, by the region they came from, the kind of things they brought with them, whether it's musical forms, which I have written about, or other cultural practices. And I think that while Jayant doesn't write about the elite, he writes about very, very the small people, if you like, right? And the working classes. So they are not necessarily engaged in quite the same kind of cultural practice that maybe the middle classes of Mumbai eventually emerged as being part of. But at the same time, I think that what he's able to articulate is a life form of a certain kind, the life form of a hustling, bustling city. As he says, someone who runs on the platform and jumps into the train every day to go to work.
So shifting over a little bit from your own translation practice now to, I mean, I don't. Okay, I think I'll ask this question first, since we are in Azim Premji University and we are also trying to do various things with language and translation in our courses. So, in the current context, and this is a way of opening out the larger question of translation right now at this juncture. So, how do you think translation can be taught, say, in higher education settings, right? I mean, and how do you think it's important to include, why do you think it's important to include translation in settings like undergraduate colleges or postgrad or even PhD programs, etc.?
So I think that while today monolingualism is not necessarily as rampant as one would imagine with globalization, there are more efforts to bring in fragments and snippets of other languages to also transform the English that people are using. That's definitely happening. But people are also working only in that space and not looking at the histories of the languages that are fed into making this, whatever the very heteroglossic space that we're occupying. And I think it might be important to not to return to that idea of, I'm not talking about the purity of languages, but just saying that there are deep histories to each language. And we're pity not to be able to also set them afloat in the present in a way. And the work of translation is to do something like that, to work with those languages and find a way of also bringing it into a way by which other people can appreciate that who don't know the languages concerned. So I think that an openness to this multiplicity of languages in our context is really crucial because people are in. There is some danger of forgetting that we have so many languages because people are just using bits and pieces of whatever, like when you're texting on a smartphone or when you're listening to English pop music, whatever. While that has its own charms, one is also then pushing aside hundreds and hundreds of years of history of each of these languages, which also lead to different ways of inhabiting the planet. So to get a sense of that, I think is crucial. In higher education, it may not happen earlier. Maybe earlier, people at least who live at home, young people, are inhabiting other linguistic worlds. And when they come into a more, like a space of the university, maybe they're not having that access anymore and they're not necessarily speaking their own languages as much. But translation in the classroom will then provide them a space by which they can actually access that inner resource and make them feel that it can be validated as well.
Related to this is the question about the PG diploma in translation and creative writing that you coordinated at Ahmedabad University. So in the light and at a time when there is a lot of interest, especially from publishing houses for translations from Indian languages, how was the experience of running this course?
It took time, of course, to gather steam, but by the time the third and last cohort came about, I think they had perfected the way by which the course design would support the experience of the student in the classroom. It was an entirely online course with 2 contact sessions. And I think that what went in its favor was the fact that we could attract the finest translators and creative writers in India today and some abroad to come and teach in this course, because there is no other course of its kind. So there was everyone just immediately jumped at the opportunity to come and teach. I don't think we've had a single refusal in all the 3 years that I coordinated this course. So I think the access to quality reflection, thinking and practice of these amazing writers that we brought was the major attraction and the major reason why the course was so successful. But it's also that the people who came were highly self-selected, highly motivated, and there were very few dropouts. There may be 1 or 2 in all the 3 years. And the attempt to come back twice a week, every week, to do the assignments, to finish, some of course with deadlines and extensions, but the fact that everyone finished the course and is today actually getting contracts and publishing quite widely, winning prizes for that translation, I think is a mark of the measure of the success of the course. If you say how exactly did you do it, I have no idea. I think that depending on the experience of the practitioner was the main thing that we did, and also the way in which they were sequenced, which I take some credit for. That this question led to that question and then to another question, and this writer was followed by this writer, and this kind of writing was followed by another kind of writing. Yeah.
To think about translation in a slightly different way, in your theoretical writings, of course, in the early writings and citing translation, you talk about how translation during the colonial times was entangled in the Orientalist sort of project. And later you also write, about how for Indians or people in the post-colonial context, and also for feminist subjects, how we need to think of ourselves as already living in translation, right? You use the phrase living in translation in various contexts, and also the need to translate the conceptual vocabulary for any kind of social movements. So can you talk a bit more about this?
I think the reason my attention was drawn to that was precisely my experience in feminist groups from the 80s, 90s onwards. And the fact that an earlier sense of the urban feminist, English speaking, who was the one spearheading some of the early feminist protests, that changed very rapidly. And one couldn't then address that situation by only showcasing English all the time, right? So I think there's a very concrete problem of having to deal with multiple languages in organizing, in the movements and so on, that led me to think about this, more deeply. But I also think that one can't simply replace the problem of translation by just taking the indigenous vocabulary and saying that we have solved the problem. We will only use that vocabulary. Because I think that the languages we use, the political languages we use, have already been deeply transformed beyond recognition. And we are part of a larger world in which what we are saying might look somewhat different, but it's not completely unique. We are still drawing on bits and pieces of conceptual frameworks that have come to us from elsewhere. So this is the reality of our modern life. And I think to deal with that is what I mean when I say we have to live in translation. It's not to choose one or the other, but to perpetually move between one and the other.
And to think of it as an enabling condition.
Yeah, exactly. Not to be paralyzed by it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to something when you mentioned and the larger link between translation and the Indian languages scene, right? Or the current status of Indian languages rather. And you were talking about students coming in, growing up in their own language settings and then coming into an English education space and then not being able to use those languages of, not finding the right opportunities, resources, space, etc. to combine those languages with English in a certain way, right? So I'm going to sort of refer back to your 2013 EPW article, which is Indian languages in Indian higher education. And I think it's based on the 2012 TIS gathering of social scientists and humanities researchers who discussed this, right? The condition and status of Indian languages in Indian higher education and what future they saw and what a roadmap they drew and all of you drew for this, right? To enable something to happen between languages in higher education. So in the article, there are sort of 6 areas that were laid out as a roadmap to strengthen Indian languages within higher education in India. One was the production of materials in Indian languages. One was curriculum augmentation. One was teacher education in bilingual pedagogy. One was research programs in and between Indian languages. And there was digital archiving and the creation of digital resources, also the integration of digital resources that were already there, and the integration of Indian archives themselves, right, at a larger level. So since 2012, when this gathering happened and this article was written, is there any of these areas you want to go back to and reflect on in terms of what's happening in terms of Indian languages in Indian higher education today, right? Where are we? I don't mean to point to either a dystopia or a utopia, like in that sense, but just reflections on any of these areas and what's been happening.
Anyway, I think we need to contextualize that. It wasn't simply a set of recommendations coming from nowhere, but we meant it explicitly to feed into the 12th 5-year plan, which is the last 5-year plan that India had. And many of us were quite deeply involved in preparing final documents for that, attended meetings in the Planning Commission. And I think we tabled what seemed to be extremely important agendas for the transformation of knowledge practices in the Indian context.
Yeah.
And I think that we can't understand what's happened today. So what I gather today and what I gather has happened today, especially after the NEP came out in 2020, is that all of these issues seem to have been addressed by something called the Bharatiya Bhasha Samiti, by an effort of the Ministry of Education, working with certain other units, working with translation. But we are just told that this has happened. I don't see any evidence of it having happened. It is claimed that all school and higher education textbooks are available in 22 Indian languages. It's not clear whether that's already available or whether it is happening. It is claimed that 1,000 translators have been hired to do this work. What are they translating from? What are they putting together? What is the vocabulary that we have existing? Do we have it existing? Without creating new vocabulary, how are you simply translating everything that exists? And you're claiming now that it actually is there. It seems like every single one of these agendas has been addressed, but we don't exactly know what has transpired. So I don't know. It's not about utopia or dystopia. I have no clue. I'm very glad that the present dispensation also feels the need to take on these agendas, and I hope that the work that we did in 2012-13 led to something like this. But how it has been used and what has come out of it, I had no idea. And I wouldn't want to say anything more about it.
So, I mean, when we think about translation also in a metaphorical sense, maybe it's also kind of migration. And I see that in your work, whether it is the work on Caribbeans and also the work on musicophilia, migration is a very central, or even the cultural migration of young women, in the when you write about cultural lives of young women. So, like, and I understand that recently you conducted a workshop on migration also. Now, how in our current context, how is migration a central question for your work?
I never thought of it like that. So it's a bit difficult in an impromptu way to start talking about it. It's true that it's featured there. And maybe it featured in the Caribbean work. It has featured in the, not so much in the India China work because that's not migration as such, but definitely in musicophilia in Mumbai, it is featured very strongly because the kind of questions I've addressed, whether it's in the Caribbean or in Mumbai, have come about because people have migrated into these places. The kind of displacement caused by migration, the things that migration enables, and what it makes impossible further, and how it transforms people's very sense of themselves and the questions that anchor their lives. I think that this is key both to understanding musicophilia and understanding the Caribbean, the question of gender and migration in the Caribbean. So I think it's for that reason, those sets of reasons, that migration then becomes a key trope, if you like, in these two books. So yeah, beyond that, I don't know.
It's it's a question of methodology and your own relationship to methodology in some sense, because we worked on ethnographic projects together. So I just want to quickly ask about your relationship to ethnography, because these are not the only projects you've done that involve ethnographic research and immersion and observation and interviews, all of those elements that form the method in some sense. So how would you think of ethnography as method? Why do you find it valuable? And what does it give you that has added to your own theoretical frameworks and thinking about?
I think to begin with, ethnography was a way of getting out of the text and had to do with my own formation as an English literature subject who only looked at textual evidence, textual support, textual substantiation for the kind of questions one was asking. So until I finished my PhD and came into my first job in an English department, I wasn't really looking at anything outside of the text in a very real way. So there was reality, there was one's life, and then there was a text. And the text was very often extremely dominant in the way in which I asked my questions about the world also. But I think maybe thinking in hindsight now, it was going to the Caribbean that dislodged that idea for me. Because originally when I put that project together in the early 90s, it was a comparative cultural study of or study of cultural practice in the West Indies and in India. And literally I had, by that time, I had read some plays, I had read some poems, I had read some novels, and I thought I was going to compare them. And after going there and realizing that the feeble questions I had about the nation and about colonialism and so on didn't really have any purchase in that space. And I began to look around to see what it was that people are informed by, and found actually that it was popular music. That's when I realized that that is not going to come to me through any book unless I actually engage with people, with practitioners and so on. That's when I started getting fascinated by the idea that practice should lead one's research. I think that's what has started me off quite a long time ago, actually, 25 years ago or more. And one aspect of that is ethnography. Qualitative ethnography as a way by which one also takes part in that form of life and is able to also step back and analyze that form of life through the interviews. I love doing interviews. I think this is again an access to the really diverse minds that people have and experiences that people come with, and find a way of pulling these things together.
So in 1993, when you were putting together this volume, which maybe in the hindsight we can say that one of the first cultural studies anthologies in India, right, interrogating modernity, and there in the introduction you talk about this difficulty with or how the Orientalism looked at the question of culture. and some kind of dissatisfaction with it, right? And how Indian culture was represented in the in the Orientalist kind of thinking. Now, definitely, the thinking about culture came from a post-colonial moment, and post-colonial or the coming together of post-colonialism and post-structuralism. But now, post-colonialism has had its own trajectory, and maybe, and you have also expressed in some of the writings some kind of difficulty with thinking about modernity, right? And especially by decolonial thinkers, some of the decolonial thinkers. So, since you mentioned Chen Guangqing's work and where he talks about critical syncretism, I was interested in how can we think about our current predicament, if you want to put it that way, where maybe on the one hand there is this dissatisfaction with the way in which the cultural question is talked about in the earlier kind of scholarship, but also increasingly a different kind of turn. Yeah. So in this moment, how do we look at this predicament, and how this idea of critical syncretism is useful for us?
I'm afraid I haven't thought about this term. It's not something that has come to me as part of my own thinking or practice. So I don't think I can actually comment on that. But in terms of where is the culture question today and where might it be taking us, I noticed that because one had to hastily evacuate the ground of culture that one was promoting because of it having now been taken over by maybe forces and formations that one is not entirely sympathetic to. I think that one needs to then ask those questions differently, and it's possible to do that by maybe grounding oneself in, as a different forms of practice, as I said, without necessarily calling it culture. Because in my current work, where I'm looking at music and musicians across India and China, again, if you keep saying culture, then you just produce an essentialist notion of culture as national in either side, on either side, right? So if you don't talk about culture in quite that way, but simply go very close to the ground and talk about the actual practice and talk about music, then maybe you're still talking about culture, but without calling it that.
Thank you, Professor Tejaswini Niranjana, for spending time with us, talking to us about some of the questions we had. And this is only touching upon only some areas of the work that you have done. And I'm sure maybe we'll have more detailed conversations later as well.
Thank you. Thank you for the compelling questions.